Okay, to talk a little bit about the film. This was a film made, I think, a year and a half ago it was finished. The films are all made without a script or a storyboard. So in this case, the film was made with an idea. I wanted to do drawings of Johannesburg in the moment. And it started with a photograph, which you see half, it's not clear in the drawing, which was of in the photograph you could identify a golf club, a curio sculpture of a giraffe, the bottom half of a garden umbrella, and what in fact they were the weapons of a crowd that was chasing someone through the streets intent on killing the person. There were a large number of xenophobic attacks in Johannesburg against people from Zimbabwe and further north in Africa about two and a half years ago in Johannesburg, and that was the starting point, this kind of astonishing bringing in of this violence into a very domestic and domesticated setting with those kinds of weapons. So that photograph was a starting point, and out of that came various drawings of Johannesburg, the Ethiopian section of downtown Johannesburg, which is where, when I was a child, I used to go for my dentistry, and doctors were all in that part of town. And gradually, as the film developed, I realized it became more and more about my mother's aging and preparation for dying. So that became an important section. Then all the home movies started coming into the film. There are a lot of the drawings of different things, like there's a Lutyens War Memorial. You can recognize it be very similar to the India Gate and the great buildings of Delhi, designed by the same architect in South Africa as kind of our urban landscape. And the film gradually developed from that moment outwards. Some things are very local and specific. In Johannesburg, a lot of our geography is defined by the mine dumps around the city, the earth that's been taken out of the ground, following the thin seam of gold that is the basis for Johannesburg's existence. Johannesburg has a geological rather than a geographic reason for existence. Its only reason for being there, and it's only been there for 130 years, is gold that was discovered in that site. So you have these very large artificial hills of the earth excavated. But then as the price of gold went up, it was found it was economically viable to take all these hills away again and reprocess all the sand in them to get out the minute amount of gold. So our local geography kind of changed enormously. These mountains were simply removed. One of the things that disappeared during the making of the film was, in fact, that drive-in cinema, which was a famous drive-in cinema on the top of one of these mine dumps, which through a lot of effort had been declared a national heritage site. This great drive-in cinema looking at the city, but was not protected with the hill on which it stood. So the hill was taken away, and of course the screen itself came down. So that was both an image, a receptacle for the home movies they could then sit onto the screen, and the destruction and ending of the screen became kind of connected to the idea of the ending of a life. So the film gradually found its form and meaning in this way. And to bring it back to what I was saying about the work in the studio, because the films aren't made with a script or storyboard, but start somewhere in the middle and then expand backwards and forwards, the presence of those fragments in the form of the drawings done and sketches or notes to myself are vital in gradually allowing the next image, the next sequence to filter in and sit and be ready to be drawn. And what I described earlier as the circling of the studio, while thoughts are germinating, while different thoughts are competing for what should be drawn, is what I would describe as a kind of productive procrastination. It's both of those. It's putting off the moment when you actually have to start working and drawing, but it's also an essential delaying of that moment. So this kind of animation drawing and this use of charcoal, and of these films which are all made with charcoal, has been a vital part of my practice for the last 30 years. And there's something about the I mean, it's very odd. In Johannesburg is a city very much without color. It's in a part of the country which in winter is very, very dry, and the grass goes very brown, in a very light yellow, almost white, and there are usually felt fires, so then the whole terrain is black, and it's a very harsh light. And so there's something about the landscape itself which feels much closer to a charcoal drawing than it would to the lush color of oil paint or of gouache. That when I started drawing in charcoal, it suddenly felt, okay, I was at home in this rather barren, bleak landscape. It was as if the landscape and the objects that get drawn meet the drawing halfway. They ask to be drawn. In the same way that a black and white photograph is close to a charcoal drawing in its tonal range, in the grayscale that it has, in the way that old black and white cinema comes towards charcoal drawing. And then also some of the objects which are drawn themselves appear almost as if they're halfway drawings themselves. So old Bakelite telephones, the blackness of that old plastic, that matte plastic you find in an old telephone, is also, it seems, halfway there to being a drawing. So a lot of the material and the subject matter picks up on things that are inviting themselves to be drawn. The fact that the landscape is this artificial landscape defined by the straight edges of the top of a mine dump or of power lines or of water pipes are already drawings in the land itself that come towards this kind of landscape. So that's one kind of body of work, which we can come back to in due course. But I want now to move on to a very different body of work, and this is the section, the compression of the much longer lecture I was going to talk about, and that is about one of the pieces which can be seen in its entirety at Volt Gallery from tomorrow. And it's work that was done in relation to a production of the opera The Nose by Dmitri Shostakovich, which I did also, I think, 2.5 years ago. But the project started about 2 years before that. And to give a brief introduction, in 1837, Nikolai Gogol writes a short story which describes how a Russian bureaucrat wakes one morning and finds that his nose has disappeared. And the short story is about this bureaucrat's attempt to find his nose and get it reattached. And to start with the collegiate assessor, as he is, which is about a third of the way up the rank of the hierarchy of Russian bureaucracy, goes and sits in a cafe to think, what can he do with hiding his missing nose? When he thinks he recognizes someone coming out of a shop across the street, and he follows it and realizes it is his nose, but dressed in the uniform of someone of a higher rank than he is himself. And he follows it into a church, and there he tries to talk to it and explain that the nose should come back. But the nose says, I'm of a completely different rank. I'm from a different government department. I've got nothing to do with you. I'm not going to say a word. And the Kovalyov, the bureaucrat, retires to consider what should be done. And he tries to go to the chief of police, but the chief of police is not in his office. And he tries to put an advertisement in the newspaper for the return of his nose, but the newspaper says they won't take these kinds of advertisements. And he is distraught. And then eventually a policeman knocks on his door and said, they've arrested his nose. It was trying to go to Riga, from St. Petersburg to Riga, dressed as a civil councillor, but he recognized it, and he's brought it back, and he hands him back his nose. And then Kovalyov attempts to reattach his nose to his face with spit and with glue, but the nose won't stick. Then he calls in a doctor, and the doctor tries to attach it, but also without success. But the doctor offers to buy it and says he'll put it in a jar of sour vodka, and then he can show it around at different fairs, and this will all be fine. And then one morning, Kovalyov wakes up, and he discovers that his nose is back on his face, and all is well. And that's the end of the story, but it's not quite the end for Gogol. This is, remember, being written in 1837. And at the very end of the short story, it's only about 10 pages long, Gogol writes, Gogol writes a text that I do not have in these notes. I had it. Oh, no, we will. This is what Gogol writes, the end of his short story that he's told us. Only now, after much reflection, can we see that there is a lot that is very far-fetched in the story. Apart from the fact that it's highly unlikely for a nose to disappear in such a fantastic way, and then reappear in various parts of the town dressed as a state councillor, it is hard to believe that Kovalyov was so ignorant as to think that newspapers would accept advertisements about noses. No, writes Gogol, I don't understand it, not a bit. But the strangest, most incredible thing of all is that authors should write about such things. That, I confess, is beyond my comprehension. It's just, no, I don't understand it at all. Firstly, it's no use to the country whatsoever. Secondly, I simply don't know what one can make of it. And yet, if you stop to think for a moment, there's a grain of truth in it. Whatever you may say, these things do happen in the world. Rarely, I admit, but they do happen. So this is Gogol writing in 1837. And there are three key points that make it of interest for me to spend the years working on the short story, on the opera, on a series of projections which are shown at the exhibition here in Mumbai under the title, I Am Not Me, the Horse Is Not Mine. And the first has to do with the continuing question, which is the question in Tsarist Russia, but also obviously in Russia of a later date, but still in the contemporary world, and that has to do with the terror of hierarchy. The sense that if you are of a higher rank than someone else, you have a murderous contempt for them, and if you are of a lower rank, you're in abject terror of them. This is something that Gogol's writing about, but it still concerns us in Russia in the 1930s with Shostakovich, and it concerns us in 2013 in certainly South Africa, and I would suspect in India too. So this is a theme that continues. The second theme has to do with the division of the self. the fact that the nose is of Kovalyov but separate from him, he's in conflict with himself. To what extent do we have control over who we are, over our thoughts, over our impulses? And this is, I mean, this is 70 years before Freud. It's a whole era which seems much earlier. It's an early root of modernism. And I'm very interested in things that we think of as very contemporary. The self-reflectiveness of an artwork have these roots so much further back. And in fact, Gogol is one step back, but it goes back from Gogol to Sterne with Tristram Shandy, and Tristram Shandy goes back to Cervantes with Don Quixote to 1601. So there's a strain of modernism that goes back many hundreds of years, and so to feel one is working within that strain is a long trajectory rather than simply a contemporary or 100-year-old aberration. And the third element of the story, which is a continuing exploration for me, has to do with the privileging of the absurd, with taking the absurd seriously. Not to say that the absurd is simply a joke or is simply humorous, but that the absurd takes a dislocation in conventional logic, that a nose can separate from the face, and then follows that absurdity with great assiduity and great logic to the end of what that implies. And I would suggest that, in fact, in many areas of the world, that view of the absurd is, in fact, a very naturalist way of describing what happens. So to take the case in South Africa, and growing up in South Africa, I was very aware of the absurdity of the world that we lived in. I mean, under apartheid, we didn't just have racial classifications of white and black. We had white and African, and then we had Indian as a separate category altogether, and then we had Chinese that were classed separately and similar to Indian, but Japanese were classified as honorary whites because we did a lot of business with it. And then there was a category called other Asian. And then there were all these different things which had a series. And then this was followed through as if this was a completely naturalist piece of logic, as if that's the way the world was. And the absurdities that came through this at the end were as absurd as a nose separated from its face. And I think in many parts of the world there are large practices and large understandings that defy logic, that are dislocated from an understanding of the world, in which the absurd becomes an important category for looking at them, as a metaphor for them, for describing them. So the project of the nose was a project which was both a way of looking at art making in the Soviet Union, where Shostakovich had written his opera. One simply has to think of the show trials and the double logic and the extraordinary language that was used by people trying to understand what was happening in their own country and to their own party to understand it. So part of the project in the exhibition is a transcript of one of the show trials of Bukharin, in which the absurd is not the image but the language itself, and the impossibility of logical argument within that language. Now, to do the project, there was quite a large team assembled, as there is to do an opera, with a costume designer and set designer working with me and lighting designers. And what I'll show you is some of the first workshops done to start to work on it. And then after that, some photographs of the production itself on the stage at the Met Opera as a background to the work that can be seen properly on the exhibition. Okay. I just have to find this again. As you can see, it's not in great order. Wedding picture, sorry. We can go through all of those at another stage. So this is a fragment of some filming done during the first workshop, in which I gathered together some dancers, the team I was working with, to try to see what was the visual language we could start working with in the production.
Okay. Yeah,
To explain this, I said to all the people, there were young dancers and some actors in Johannesburg, I said, do any of you know how to do Russian dances? So, do you know Russian dances? And they said, well, none of us really knew Russian dances, but don't you get low and you kick your legs out? So he said, okay, let's do dance where you get low and you kick your legs out. And we had this very glorious large overcoats, policemen's coats, which our costume designer had been made. And one by one, the different members attempted their Russian dance. And we simply put a lamp at an angle so that the shadows projected were elongated and distorted. And this was kind of the first attempt of one of the young men, Tato Molwena, who was trying his Russian dance out.